Today we are going to start in on the floor for the van, and in a difference from what is probably our most controversial video to date, we are going to insulate the floor this time around. With our last van, like we've said a couple times since we started this new series, we were planning an adventure van for primarily the Northeast United States. This van's a little different, so we're doing a few things a little differently, and one of them is we are insulating the floor this time around. We still stand by
100% we stand by that decision.
The decision not to do it last time. And we had no issues for 3 years, including with cold. Primarily we were dealing with cold and not with hot, but we spent summers in Maryland. We spent, it wasn't like we weren't in warm areas ever.
But with that being said, there still is some heat loss, right? And when we were building out a low-top van, we were scrounging for every bit of head clearance. So we made the decision to just forego the insulation entirely on the bottom.
But now that we have a high-top van, and Andy is about 6 feet tall, so we can easily.
We have about 6'6" headroom in here, so I have 6 extra inches to work with. And we did some math the other night and figured out how thick our roof material is going to be. So we're going to lose an inch on the ceiling, and that still gives us several inches to work with, and while still having some decent headroom and not making it look cave-like. So we decided to go ahead and use some of that extra height room real estate that we have and insulate.
We also have plans to leave Aiden in the van by himself occasionally. Not very often, but we definitely want to do our very best to insulate the van so that he's comfortable while that happens. And we'll get to some of the other modifications that we're gonna do to make that possible later on through the build. But this is one of those places that we're just gonna be adding just a little bit of extra from what we did last time.
Yeah.
So this time, what's the plan?
What's the plan? Not to go crazy, but we're gonna put a 1/2 inch of expanded polystyrene foam on the bottom. And then we're gonna go with a 1/2 inch of plywood on top.
All right.
It's going to give us a total thickness of 1 inch.
1 inch. Give or take a couple millimeters for adhesive.
So we're going to be doing 2 things. First, we're going to be gluing down the insulation to the actual metal floor of the van. And then we're going to be gluing the plywood on top of that. So it's going to be the glue that provides most of the strength here, in addition to a few bolts around the perimeter of the floor. Now, the Promaster comes from the factory with some tie-down locations. So we're just going to get slightly longer bolts and use those tie-down locations to hold the floor to the van. Because in most cases, all you need to do is prevent the floor from shifting around. We're not going to fill the gaps between the ribs and the floor with wood, and we're not going to do furring strips to attach the insulation to. Mostly because it's not necessary at all. The foam, this particular foam has a crush strength of 25 pounds per square inch. And when you put a piece of plywood on top of that and spread your load over the entire sheet, it's very, very low. It's not even going to dent, and it's just not worth the time or the effort, right?
Not worth the time, the effort, the weight, or the money that would be required to put those furring strips at the bottom. And we're also not going to be putting screws in. Just
remember, whenever you run a screw through the bottom of your van, you're puncturing like the factory undercoating, galvanizing, zinc plating, or whatever. And whatever you're going to do is not as good as the factory.
And you're just going to end up getting rust. So we're choosing not to do that. We're going to use the bolt holes for the tie downs and some adhesive. So let's get going.
So we're actually going to start with the plywood and cut all our pieces to size and trace and do all that stuff. And then we're going to transfer it to the foam afterwards.
Yeah. So we're gonna cut to the edge.
Yep.
And then
we'll go in.
And then we'll go in and scribe.
Scribing it, yeah.
Okay.
Because I don't have a fancy track saw or anything like that, we do this the old school way. And I measure off my blade offset to the edge of the saw body, and I set my straight edge there. This particular skill saw, it is whatever is between 1.5 and 1 5/8 inches.
It's 9/16.
9/16. So dumb. quick tip if you're measuring precision things, the end of your tape measure has this little thingamajigger on the end. So if you want to get stuff more precise, like I actually will measure between the 1 down. So I measured from here to here rather than from here to here.
This seems as good a time as any to tell you to please, please, please do not ever put your hand in front of a saw. Andy has a terrible habit of this. Do not do what he does. It is a terrible idea. How do you know?
So I'm just coming down and marking 5 inches down.
Okay.
I'm going to do that along the whole way.
Okay.
And then we will. So far the band's pretty square. I'm liking that.
Andy's ADHD got the better of him there, so let me give a quick explanation. In order to get the plywood to fit the curved portion of the van, we need to scribe the plywood around the curves. Andy slid the plywood as far forward as he could and then took a measurement of the largest gap, this spot right here. This came to 4 3/4 inches, so he added a little extra for cushion to make it 5 inches. He then placed the ruler so that it touches the little step in the driving compartment and makes a mark at the 5-inch point. He does this at multiple spots along the lip and the beam that are on either side of the walls. He then connected those dots and cut along the line. This will give us a nice initial rough cut that we can then refine with further test fits. In this case, the initial rough cut was almost perfect and we only had to do a minor trim. The second piece on the floor was really easy as it was just a rectangle and we just needed to cut it to fit widthwise, which brings us to the trickiest panel.
Now the pattern here is a lot harder than like the completely straight edges up here. Because we got to go around the wheel wells and there's like some jogs and ins and out and a bunch of angles and stuff. And I don't want to measure all that and transfer it to a piece of plywood. So I'm going to use what's called a tick sheet here, or a tick board, or whatever you want to call it. So essentially I have a piece of really thin plywood and then I cut this pointer. So what we'll do is we will line the pointer up with a feature on the van, so the inside of the wheel well. And I'll make a mark. And then I will continue this. All the way around. And then once I'm done, I will take this piece of wood and put it on top of my plywood and then set this back on top, and I'll be able to mark where all the extents of the van is. We did this on the last one and it worked really well.
I have zero memory of doing this on the last one, which is terrifying.
It's literally one of my most clever moments
It is,
in the
very
entire
clever.
van build.
Good on that side?
Yeah.
All right, let's do the other side. So where did you even get this idea to do this?
It was in a book written by Daniel Spur originally in the 1980s. And this was a technique that he used to measure for bulkheads in sailboats.
There's a lot of crossover between sailboats and vans, and there's a lot of stuff that's usable, applicable at both.
Including this
cases.
chicken scratch. So
Yeah.
this doesn't look like much. It looks like a mess right now, but trust me, this will all make sense in a little bit.
It looks a little bit like you lost the thread and that you've gone a little nuts, but we're going to see how it turns out.
So I have this taped down now, and what we're going to do is we're just going to line everything up. best as we can. Then just mark the points. Mark the tip. So this is going to make pretty much a copy of what's inside the van on the plywood. So we'll end up with a whole bunch of dots, and then we'll just connect the dots and go from there. Now we're connecting the dots. I'm going to cut slightly inside the line because I want a little bit of a gap between the sheet metal and the plywood.
Oh man, that is darn close. Darn close. So close.
So close. I got that angle off a little bit while I did there,
Just a couple quick adjustments and checking that the back doors will close, and we're finished with the subfloor. We used the subfloor panels as a template to cut the foam insulation.
Earlier I mentioned that we're going to bolt the floor down in addition to gluing, and to locate the bolt holes that are existing in the floor onto the plywood, I made these patent pending bolt hole locators, which are just the factory tied out bolts with the heads chopped off. And I will screw these in and then grab my plywood or foam and stick them down on top, and they will make marks on the plywood or the foam of where I need to drill for the bolt holes.
Then we're gonna drill.
Drill, countersink, and glue it down. I'm probably going to countersink after because I want to make sure I don't countersink the wrong side.
That's probably a good idea. All right.
All right, let's go.
Did it work? Yep.
And yep.
Sweet.
Okay, let's remove the patent pending bolt hole locators.
We're gonna rinse and repeat on this for the other two panels, and then we will come back as we install.
So you remember like 5 minutes ago when I told you we're not going to use any furring strips? I changed my mind. So where the boards meet is like between a rib, and there's like a little bit of flex if you're standing on either side, and I don't want them to like flex. We kind of had this problem with the old van, is that where the flooring met on top of the two panels, it eventually tore. So I think what we'll do is we'll run just like a piece of 4-inch wide or 3-inch wide plywood underneath of the seam, and then we'll screw into it, and then that will be nice and strong. So we'll glue and screw that, and we'll glue and screw that, and because it's 1/2 inch, it'll be the same thickness as the foam, so everything else will be on top of foam.
After one last dry test fit with all of the pieces and the furring strips, it was time to permanently install. We used marine adhesive to glue the foam to the metal floor, and then the same adhesive between the foam and the plywood. The last step was to screw the plywood into the furring strips and then send the bolts through both layers and into the van's metal floor.
Floor is installed. We are super happy with how it's turned out. It's glued, it's screwed, it's
Bolted.
It's not moving. And we're really happy with how little it's flexing. I think things went really well. Is there anything you'd change?
I don't think so. I think one thing we did change halfway through was our decision to put furring strips between the two planks, and I'm really glad we did.
Yeah, me too. I think that worked out really well.
Before we did that, there was quite a bit of like bounce between the sheets.
Yeah, and I think that solved for that. So those like bridging furring strips, super important, and I definitely would do that again. Other than that, I think it came out pretty awesome.
I think it came out great.
We're very happy.
Very happy.
On our next episode, we are going to be mocking up our interior design and we are going to start insulating the walls and ceiling. We'll see you next time.